Joining us at this very exciting Time of the Writer Festival, the 27th iteration of the same. It goes on between the 14th and the 21st of March in 2024. And the theme for this year's Time of the Writer Festival is reflections, resonance, and revival. And that's precisely what we're going to try and talk about through the lens of Justice Malala's book, The Plot to Save South Africa. Here it is, hold it up. In case you haven't seen it. And joining me, of course, very kindly so, via New York, but through Cape Town. Justice, I don't know quite how you managed that, but you did. And thanks for making the time to join us to talk about your very important book. And welcome. First, I must ask you, what does it feel like to be on the other side of the screen? I think most people would have known you other than being a columnist, but also before being a television talk show host, a very serious one, I might add. It had a bit of levity, but I'm wondering how it feels to be on the other side and whether I can finally exact some revenge from you.
Thank you so much, Ebrahim. It's quite something. You know, I've had these interactions with you on my old show, The Justice Factor. It was always such a joy and a pleasure to have you on the show. But I confess that I have some butterflies in my tummy about, what's Ebrahim gonna do to me? He's gonna ask me tough questions. But it's also great fun and to be engaging with you about I know a subject and a subject that you've reflected on quite a lot, particularly my sort of examination of it was about leadership, and I know you write a lot about these things, about leadership today and in the past, and what we might have after May 29, what the future leadership looks like. So I'm excited, but I'm very scared of you right now.
Well, you shouldn't be, given how familiar you are with your ability to have abused me on live television. I think you'll find that I'll be much kinder. And I certainly am very kind about the book. I really did find it an easy read. It was fluent. It was very fluent. It's got some beautiful turns of phrase, some of which I will hope to highlight as we go along. But let me just, by way of quick introduction, in case anyone doesn't know who Justice Malala is, he's the author of this book, The Plot to Save South Africa. It is ostensibly in the popular imagination about the murder of Chris Hani, and it certainly is about that. But it's also about the way in which approaches to leadership managed what could have been quite a significant and tumultuous point of political instability at a time of a delicate time, I think, in South Africa's transition away from apartheid to democracy. So it's a lot about Hani, but it is a lot about leadership. It also, as a social history sense, is a lot about the different characters which feature here. And one of the outstanding features of Justice's book, and thanks, Justice, for writing it in that way, is that it's a bit of a story. It's not dry history or even historiography. It is that, but it is told in a narrative style, which is quite exciting and interesting. And so, first, I would ask you, why did you get away from this sort of linear approach of describing the processes and events and how they unfolded? And why did you go for a shifting narrative? And what I mean by shifting narrative is that you talk about events happening on the same day, but in different places.
Thank you. As I detail in the book, for those who haven't got it yet, and I hope they do go out and get it. The first thing was that on the day I was, on the first day, on the day of the murder of Chris Hani, I was a cadet reporter at the Star newspaper in Johannesburg. I had started on the 1st of February 1993. And I'd been in a classroom throughout that time. When Easter weekend came along, all the senior reporters, all the people that I admired and wanted to emulate, they took the weekend off, as most of South Africa does. And And that weekend, the rookies, were asked to come on doing shifts, and you call the police and say, what's happening, and they tell you, oh, one person died here and so forth, and you either write it up if there's a paper the next day or not. And so that's what I was doing that day. And the call comes into the newsroom that Chris Hani has been murdered. And I'm sent out with a few other people to Boksburg to write about this, to record this, to report on what happened. So from the onset, for me, the story, a huge number of things were happening. Calls were being made between world leaders, calls were being made between national leaders. I had no window into that. So I was carving my own story about, you mentioned in your social post earlier today, Bazima Shilowa is at the home of Chris Hani. He's devastated. You go and you say, oh, what happened? Where were you? What did you do? And so your story is linear, but there is so much more happening in the world at the same time. I wanted to write the story in a way that I could explain it and bring it home to my kids, to a greater South African audience, without making them feel, or without making the audience feel as if it's being forced to, have your cucumber. I wanted to show the fear, the sheer sense of, oh, my heart is in my throat kind of fear that I had as a young South African, who I was very invested in what was happening, in the sense that for me that period was a time of transition, the end of apartheid, and the beginning of this great democratic dispensation that we had thought sometime in the 80s. When I was a teenager, I thought, no, it's never going to happen. When riots were ripping through the country, we had hope, but did I realistically think that the apartheid government would fall? Many of us we lived with hope, but with a certain tempering of our expectations that this wasn't going to happen. So the period between 1990 and 1994 was a huge time of hope for me and for many, other people across this land. And so I wanted to illustrate that sense of hope and the sense of anger and fear and hopelessness, even that gripped many of us when we heard that Chris Hani had died. So that was the beginning of it. And then I wanted to bring in all these other perspectives. I particularly wanted to illustrate the anger of young people at the murder of Chris Hani. And I as you know, I wrote about a group of young people in the Eastern Cape in Port St. John's who were directly, tragically, became participants in the broader events of that week.
Yeah, and they certainly did something to two people, white South Africans, but who had a fairly progressive outlook as white South African compared to white South African outlooks at the time. And this is a question I'll come back to a little later in our discussion. I also want to read a short extract of how you wrote up white people's reactions specifically to Hani's murder at the time. But let's set that aside now. And I mean, you skillfully, as a journalist, but also as a storyteller, have brought out exactly what you said. On the one hand, the anger of young South Africans, the go-betweening that happened between leaders, both of the liberation movement then, but also the old National Party and the apartheid government and its security structures and so on. But there's one curious thing, and I just want to turn to that from the text and read a little bit of it to give listeners a flavor of the writing style and so on, but also just to draw out a particular question, because there's someone in our public life who claims to know about this, and who claims to know about the motives behind Hani's murder, and what their motives were and how they went about doing this, but steadfastly appears to refuse to say anything about it. But just for a moment, just hold on. So you posed this question on page 225. Was Valus alone on that day? Was it just an amateur who happened to have got caught, or did he give himself up for the capture to let bigger fish escape? His actions were decidedly not those of a man who wanted to evade arrest. At the amnesty application for both Valush and Darby Lewis at the TRC in 1997, Judge Bernard Mwepe asked, "What worries me was that in broad daylight, Valush goes to Mr. Hani's place. He shoots him. He walks away. He gets into the car. He drives away. The weapon is left in the car, and he just normally joins the traffic as if nothing has happened. What assurance did he have? Did he have that some kind of assurance that don't you worry? You can do it. Even if I do it, you can be covered somehow. Don't you worry." Darby Lewis and Valush claimed that no one else knew about the Hani murder plot. Yet the same set of people in your narrative keep on cropping up again and again before and after the murder with surprising regularity. Now, there's one person, as I said, in our public life, and social media has drawn a lot of ire about us raising this question. You interviewed people, you went through archival material, you went through newspaper reportage like a nice historian and storyteller. You went to uncover details about characters and so on. But this one person, a former president of the Republic of South Africa, President Jacob Zuma, who has repeatedly said he knows something about this. Has he said anything, firstly, given your extensive engagement with the archive? And secondly, Justice, you obviously, as I say, engaged a lot of the material. You also spoke to a lot of people. Was he just not forthcoming? Did you just not bother interviewing him?
Thank you. So President Jacob Zuma has consistently over the years, in fact, over the past 15 years, given lectures. He particularly gave a lecture in the Eastern Cape in 2013, if memory serves, where the family of Chris Hani, not just wife and children, but the greater Hani family was present. He had a chance then to say, "This is what I know about the murder of your son." He didn't say it. When I started doing the research for the book, which is in earnest in 2015 and 2016, I reached out to the presidency. President Zuma was in the presidency then. I reached out and said, "Oh, would you be so kind as to grant me an interview?" I didn't receive an answer. I tried several times for that, and I still haven't received an answer, even after he left office in 2018. I want to say President Zuma keeps on saying these things. And if you go to the archive at any point during those 9 days of absolute chaos in South Africa and fear and all kinds of mayhem, President Jacob Zuma does not come across as a player, as someone who did anything in the period that Chris Hani was murdered and up to the funeral. His name does not appear anywhere. When the ANC met on the 11th of February in a National Executive Committee meeting at what used to be called Shell House in central Johannesburg, the ANC made big decisions about how do we handle this, how do we respond. There were allegations that the ANC made about how in the past the apartheid government had not protected Chris Hani. Jacob Zuma is not present. Jacob Zuma likes to claim that he was the head of intelligence of the ANC. The head of intelligence of the ANC was actually Nhlanhla, Joe Nhlanhla, sorry, yeah. Joe Nhlanhla was the head of intelligence of the ANC. Jacob Zuma was not there. Jacob Zuma was in some other positions in counterintelligence and so forth, but he was not head of intelligence of the ANC and never was, actually. And so in the period, particularly after 2005, we keep on seeing Jacob Zuma claiming that he knows something, that one day he will speak. He's repeated this, in fact, at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Now, if you want a safe space to say, these are the people responsible for the murder of Chris Hani, or these are the people who may be implicated, he never said it. He said it in this public place, but in many, many instances where even when he went to the grave site of Chris Hani, with Chris Hani's wife and children present, he never revealed any of this. And so I have to tell you, I think Jacob Zuma is an outright liar when it comes to these issues. He is using the name, he's abusing the name of Chris Hani for his own political ends. It is actually quite shocking that a leader of the liberation movement would do this and would continue to abuse the name of Chris Hani in such a manner. Just in conclusion, I'd like to say one of the key people to interview about that week is someone who's discredited in our politics, but happens to have been there, and that's Carl Niehaus. Nowhere in my conversations over a long period with Carl Niehaus, and Carl Niehaus doesn't pretend that he likes me, but he spoke to me, gave me extensive interviews over a long time. Not once does he even make the sort of claims that Jacob Zuma makes. But the bottom line is this, Ebrahim. If Jacob Zuma knows something about the murder of Chris Hani 31 years ago, why does he not say anything? Why is it when he was president of South Africa for 9 full years, he did not institute a new inquiry or take any steps to say, this is the information we have, this is the information that needs to be followed up by the authorities to give comfort to the Hani and other members of the Hani family? I find it extraordinary and painful and to be honest, very, very shocking that Jacob Zuma continues to make these things.
Well, it also settles a question for a large number of South Africans who still revere Chris Hani in the way that they did and hold his memory dear. Of course, you point out in the book that there's a lot of these speculative questions about how would Chris Hani have turned out had he survived? Would he today have been the same as he was? And you provide, I think, what is the only possible answer. We can never know. And as you point out in the book, there are people who believed exactly the same thing that he did and behaved in similar ways at the time, and who turned out to be incredibly corrupt. But I wanted to just tell you that perhaps justice now is your time. President Zuma is back on the campaign trail, as you well know. So, I think if there's ever a time, is it. I doubt he'd give either of us an audience. But yeah, so this is the time, I think, to corner him. I just want to turn justice to another character who was in leadership.
Can I just, something you touched on about the meaning, perhaps, of Chris Hani, and as you rightly say, we don't know how he would have turned out. Maybe he would have turned out like the many, many leaders that we are disappointed in. But the point you make about Chris Hani at that time, at that freezing in time of this 50-year-old man who had done such incredible things with his life, is that we know who he was then, And at that time, there was so much to admire, and for us to still admire today. And so nothing can be taken away from Chris Hani. But I think people like Jacob Zuma, in my view, should know that that memory of that man that they are abusing so much is an indictment to their behavior today. So the state capture, the incredible corruption that we saw in that period between 2009 and 2018, and perhaps into this period, is Chris Hani's memory, his life, stands as an accusing finger towards all of those people.
You know, I know for a moment there you were looking for a word which starts with a D, that you were going to use to describe Jacob Zuma's behavior in abusing Hani's memory. And I know that you were going to use the word disappointed. It's disappointing rather than disgusting, which also starts with a D. But nevertheless, let's leave that there. It could be either, very well be either. Justice, I want to turn to another character who featured very strongly at the time. And you know, knowing you, I think it's either your skillful depiction of this particular character called F.W. de Klerk, or it is simply that this is the way he comes across. And I mean, I found it quite startling that, you know, there was often attempts at delegitimizing de Klerk placed, some of it misplaced, but a lot of the misplaced shenanigans to kind of, you know, either not have him attend parliament and so on were rather moot, because your description of him, and I don't know whether you did this deliberately as through a character study, or whether he just simply comes across as a moral agent. He does not come across as an agent who is a fixer of the transition. Of course, he expresses some agency because he's in that position. But for me, in reading the book, he literally just came across as a person, not in happenstance, but who was a mere facilitator rather than a puppeteer. He was less a moral agent and largely just an agent who had to go with the flow. Did you do that deliberately, or was it just that this is how this character was?
I don't know. You can remind me this, but I remember back in that period between 1990 and 94, there was one incident when Nelson Mandela was very, very angry with F.W. de Klerk, and I can't place it in my head right now. But he stood up, and it could have been at Codesa, and he said, F.W. de Klerk is a product of apartheid. He said, apartheid educated you, clothed you, and you're behaving in a manner that is that product of that system. The one thing about F.W. de Klerk and the week that I take the 9 days between the murder and the burial and the funeral of Chris Hani is that there's quite a lot of material about F.W. de Klerk, about what he did. That's in the public record. That was publicly recorded in newspapers like De Burger, Beeld, and so forth. And I've never been as glad to be able to read and understand Afrikaans as being able to get that window into him and his reactions in that week. So we start the book with F.W. de Klerk getting the news of Chris Hani's murder. And on that day, Saturday, the 10th of April, he realizes that I am powerless. I can't. Nelson Mandela is the moral leader, is the ethical leader, is the leader of this country who can intervene in some way on these issues. So de Klerk starts with a realization that is profound, that is true, and that gives him some credit. That okay, you can see something, you see something, but then that's about it for F.W. de Klerk. That's his one good decision. After that, he panics. He reverts to some, and this is from his own book, The Last Track, in which he basically says Mandela cannot control his people, in which he doesn't quite say it, but his behavior says it, that essentially blacks need to be controlled, to be told to sit. When Nelson Mandela says to him, my guy, here we have people who are deeply, deeply, deeply wounded, and we need to allow them the space to grieve. He doesn't get it. He just wants, essentially, he calls in the army. He wants a state of emergency. He cannot understand that people can be very, very angry about something as terrible as the murder of their hero and a son and brother of theirs. So after that, for me, you see de Klerk just throwing the army at the problem, as it were, shouting at Nelson Mandela, not shouting from the sidelines with his going on television, and he doesn't stop, even up to the day of Chris Hani's burial, in which he goes to Parliament and tries to address and does address an empty Parliament just to his own supporters, even the white MPs of the predecessor to the DA of today, or the DP of the 1990s, walked out and said, how can you address Parliament at the same time as Chris Hani is being buried? How insensitive is that? And at the human level, this guy does not show any Ubuntu, doesn't show any kind of sensitivity to the fact that the people that he supposedly leads, the people of South Africa, are devastated at what has happened. So you see him become a small individual, a petty. He is diminished in our eyes by the end of the book, and that's by just what we see him doing in that week. Instead of understanding what a nation could be going through, he chooses to become almost like the PW Botha of 1986, which is terrible and sad that he went that way, but he did. It's the fact.
I was trying to give you some credit here and hoping that this is just your skillful depiction and crafting of the character and the characterization. But I think the truth is it's a bit of both. I mean, he really was that kind of figure, unthinking, unfeeling, unstrategic, and in the language of the young, he just didn't get it. And worse still, he was mid, he was average.
Yeah. No, he absolutely was. And I think at the end of the book, I sort of throw forward to him at the Nobel Prize ceremony, where he shared the Nobel Prize for Peace that year with Nelson Mandela. And he lacked self-reflection, if you will. He didn't stop and say, what am I doing and who am I? He really did think that he was the sort of Boris Yeltsin equivalent of the time, or he just had no emotional. He didn't have the ability to place himself in context and see his shortcomings,
Right.
his weaknesses, and the sheer luck and chance that had placed him alongside a real giant of history and of humanity.
And of course, you point this out, right? Where, Mandela having done the first interview on the day of His death, interview, he comes across as pretty lackluster because there's all kinds of problems. I mean, the statement's not written by him, and you point out quite extensively how involved he was in his own speech making and so on. He couldn't sort of express emotion. He was tired. The damage to his eyes means that his tear ducts weren't working and so on. So it was difficult. The auto cue was too far away from him and so on. You detail all of that, but just to bring it back to de Klerk, de Klerk had to rely on Mandela's stature to see his own way through. And you point out, which reminds me, text, I just want to find it now, where you talk about de Klerk sort of relying on a speech that Mandela is purported to have made. And I think in part we're all guilty because we all seem to have a memory of this thing. But none of us can actually so we all remember hearing, can remember it actually being made. And yeah, I found it. Um, you say Mandela gave one of the most significant speeches of his life, bringing angry young black militants and fearful whites together while isolating the far right who wanted to stoke war. In his memoir, de Klerk writes, Mandela rose to the occasion in a statesman-like manner. That evening, in a broadcast that was repeated 3 times, he said, dot, dot, dot. Now, we're not quite sure what it is that he said. And then de Klerk goes on to say, before going on to quote a speech that Mandela did not actually give that evening, or rather, that's you saying it. In A Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela says he was asked to speak on the SABC that night to address the nation, and that with all the authority at his command, he applied for peace. He appealed for peace too. He too goes on to quote the same speech that is referred to by de Klerk, but that was not the address that he had delivered that night. The journalist who was working with Mandela, Richard Stengel, and then David O'Sullivan, the journalist who was reading out the first bulletins that alerted the world to Hani's murder on 702 at the time, not that we're providing a commercial, and even Hani's biographers all praised the speech that Mandela supposedly gave mere hours after the assassination. But none of us can find the speech. So quite what was said, or what do we recall purporting to have been said?
Yes, that was in many ways. It's lovely to be a reporter and try to try to do a timeline of what actually happened, because it's astonishing what memory, if you will, can do, where we've told ourselves things as a nation, and they are not quite true, but it's part of perhaps our nation building, our nation make, our attempt to build a consensus around these events and give them meaning. And I remember as well, my memories of that time were really that, what happened was that Mandela gave a speech and there was peace on earth and so forth. But actually that wasn't the speech. The speech was the lackluster speech you referred to and so forth. Only 3 days later did Nelson Mandela deliver that groundbreaking, incredibly moving, meaningful speech that we so our memory and our time, we compressed it into this thin thing between those 3 days. But Mandela didn't speak about the white woman, didn't speak about the man full of hate who murdered Chris Hani until much later. So over the next 3 days after Chris Hani's murder, the country was spiraling into further and further violence. The right wing was, what's the expression, was cock-a-hoop. They thought, yeah, we are, they had the audacity to go and shoot shoot at the ANC offices in Joburg, in central Joburg, and those kinds of things were happening. So the story of those two speeches, and how Mandela, with that second speech, really reached out and isolated the right wing, who were pushing for, who wanted a racial war, who wanted us to sink, if you will, into something that I think many of us did not want.
But Justice, that's a pivotal moment, right? I mean, why is that moment so seminal to the transition, or is that the moment at which the transition literally hung in the balance? I mean, I don't want to pretend as if history only pivots at a particular moment on a particular event or activity, but it really was seminal.
It was seminal. I think, it had been 3 years since Nelson Mandela walked out of prison on February 11th. The ANC, SACP, COSATU, others had been unbanned on February 2, 1990. We'd had CODESA, we'd had the multi-party negotiation forum. They'd fallen apart. We'd had the Patong massacre. We sometimes these days come and pass, and you and I, Ebrahim, will remember. But we Patong Sebokeng, there were tens and hundreds of people killed. The Val townships, Everton, and them were burning and burning and burning. So we were at this point, and I think that speech and that week signaled that no matter how long and how steadfastly de Klerk and his team tried to hold on to this attempt at negotiating minority rights, particularly giving themselves power beyond the end of the negotiations, essentially inserting themselves into power post the settlement that was being negotiated. That week, I think, underlined and illustrated that they couldn't go on forever. And I think that is why, for me, that week was the one where the ANC and Nelson Mandela became bolder and said, we now absolutely must have an election date. It wasn't granted in that week, but in the 6 weeks afterwards, we had an election date. I think a key part of it was agreeing that there would be a transitional council in which the apartheid government, the National Party and others did not have sway and absolute authority over the security forces and other arms of government. So I think Chris Hani's enduring gift to us and to that process was that it was in that week that Nelson Mandela perhaps found his voice to demand, and the ANC and the progressive forces around him, the mass democratic movement in general, actually went for it, and there's somewhere where the Cyril Ramaphosa of the time says that we went for the jugular, and I think they actually did, and the apartheid government caved, and what they should have caved way before, but they did. And I think April 27 was largely because of that week and Chris Hani's the push that Chris Hani's murder gave to the mass democratic movement.
So you're obviously aware that there's criticisms that, I mean, yes, Ramaphosa of the time says we went for the jugular. He was Secretary General of the ANC at the time, right?
Yeah, he was the secretary,
Yeah, and chief negotiator.
the chief negotiator, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, so there's people who criticize the fact that, well, the ANC and the negotiating forces could have sort of extracted many more concessions. We could have been much more radical in kind of getting stuff out of these people, and so on. But I wonder if there's a sufficient appreciation of just how delicate things were. And the extraction of the fact that you can get a TEC, or a transitional executive council, under which whose command the security forces and everyone else would now fall under, and have a definitive election date without many of the other critical issues not being hammered out.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Do
And
you
I
think
think,
you think there's any validity to kind of saying we could have got more out of these guys?
oh, you could always get more with these kinds of negotiations. I think people can say all that, but I think it's worth putting ourselves in the shoes of those negotiators at that time when 4,000 people were dying every year between 1990 and 94, every year, in political violence. It's an extraordinary number that people were being hacked to death on trains in Johannesburg. Um, I come from north of Pretoria and Hammanskraal. In the train between Mabopane and Belle Ombre in Marabastad, people were being attacked as they went to work or came back from work by the IFP Amabucho, who were being paid for by the apartheid government and third force agents. So, it wasn't just what was happening in the room and, oh, we got to get this. And I think we have to be humble enough to say the armed struggle had not extracted the kind of fruit that many people now pretend, oh, we could have done this, we could have done that, we had them in a corner. It was largely a stalemate, and it was a negotiation, not just a walkover. We've won. We hadn't won. There were other forces at play. There was, the end of the Cold War, the end, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and all that. So we were part of a global movement and a local movement. I think if anybody really won, it's probably the mass democratic movement, which had made many townships, many places all across South Africa ungovernable. But largely, you had to negotiate. And I think there isn't an appreciation, and that's the word you used, and I think it's absolutely opposite. There isn't an appreciation of just how tough things were in those rooms. But just one last thing, I'm talking about Cyril Ramaphosa. I tried to interview Cyril Ramaphosa for this book. I started asking him for interviews back in 2017. Even by the time the book went to print last March, Cyril Ramaphosa had not given me an interview. And I'm particularly interested in Cyril Ramaphosa's interview in 2003. This is for all the historians who are listening to it, in which he gave an interview to Parik O'Malley. And Ebrahim, you'll know Parik O'Malley's work. We all use it. He did an incredible, amazing thing by interviewing virtually every one of those negotiators and others in the period after, late 80s, early 90s. But humongous archive of work. So in 2003, Steve Trotter accuses Cyril Ramaphosa, Matthew Xhosa, Tokyo Sefale of some plot, accusing Thabo Mbeki of being involved. Whether it's true or not, clearly
or accusing them of wanting to get rid of Thabo Mbeki.
Exactly. So at that time, Cyril Ramaphosa gives an interview to Parikomali, but that interview is embargoed to 2030. So now, for the past 7 years, Cyril Ramaphosa does not give me an interview, and I'm waiting for 2030 to hear what exactly Cyril Ramaphosa said to Parikomali and won't say to any one of us in South Africa. Again, you have an ANC leader. ANC leaders, many ANC leaders just won't speak on Chris Hani's passing. And my question is, you all stand up every year, just watch on April 10th, there will be, with an election coming up, there will be hundreds of Chris Hani. But when you say, let me ask you questions the way Ebrahim is asking me questions, let's have a go at it. None of them want to ask questions, but they're very happy to get on a stage and just basically talk down to people about Chris Hani.
It's a date, Justice. Remember to take me. I'm diarizing it now. 2030. Justice Malala must take me with, so we can uncover what is sealed in the Patrick O'Malley archives. And
Absolutely.
unlike the many columns you did for Financial Mail on restaurants and food, of which you didn't take me to, and I'll remember that. I'm still hurt and wounded. I won't forgive you, but maybe you'll be able to earn some forgiveness if you take me to this 2030 date in which we uncover what is said. But
Wow.
why are we being speculative, Justice? I mean, you know, and you point this out in the book in several places that Clive Darby Lewis tells this Janus Falush, the guy who pulls the trigger, don't do it on the Easter weekend. I think there's 4 or 5 places in which this comes up. Don't do it on the Easter weekend. What would have happened if he didn't? All the stuff we're talking about, and I mean, of course, we're not theorizing because this is historiography. Are you perhaps pointing to the fact that, listen, this wider conspiracy, and you address some of that towards the end of the book, this wider conspiracy that Easter weekend, if Valush had listened to Darby Lewis, if it didn't happen now, if it didn't happen then, it would have happened at another time, because these tools were merely instruments that could have been deployed at another time.
Yeah, I mean, there's reference in the book to an incident some time before when Janus Valush approached Chris Hani in a hotel lobby in Johannesburg. So he'd been stalking him before the actual murder. This weekend was a weekend in which Chris Hani had sent his bodyguards home, and so was without a bodyguard. But I don't think, I think Chris Hani was a marked man and would have been murdered after this date of 10th April. But he was definitely, you know, he was supposedly third on that list and they were going to kill him. So I think it was, if he didn't die in the attempt to kill him, then he would have been, you know, that would have been a great thing. But he was being stalked, and it would have happened at some point down the line. Hopefully, the attempt might have been made with protectors around him, and it would have been stopped. But Chris Hani was a marked man.
Right, irrespective, right?
Irrespective.
And that's, yeah, and that's
It's a
so, and that's so. It's so resonant of the time, and just to think of that time which resonates with us, I want to turn for a moment to page 134. But before I do that, I just want to say we got about 12 minutes to go through, and I want to once again recommend to people to get this book, and even those of us who are used to thinking of history now in the form of a tweet, or I can't call it tweet, it's the form of an X, in the form of an X, then you will find that Justice has also very helpfully developed a timeline and chronology of events leading up to the transition. particularly the years 1990 to 1993. So you chronicle the Boy Patong massacre, you chronicle a whole range of other things that happened at that time. But just to turn to the milieu of the time, you say, if there was black anger, there was also white hate. On the country's first ever talk radio station, most callers were angry at the murder, but said that they were glad that Hani was dead. Brian from Johannesburg said, "This is a war we're involved in, and we wiped out one of their top generals. It's the survival of the fittest. Let me tell you, it's difficult to say this because it's difficult to see a man lying with his own brains blown out, but he's one of the enemy, and we wiped him out. This is a racial war, and there's only going to be one winner." Another one said, "This is the best thing that could have happened. Not everyone is sad about Hani's death," said a man who identified himself simply as a white male. A colored man, which we know as a apartheid's official designation of mixed race people from the area around Hani's home, said the murderers should be given a medal and that they should start working on getting rid of another popular leader, COSATU's then General Secretary Jay Naidu. Um, and then someone from Boksburg says he was happy in a political way that Hani was dead. And then I've got children like him. But the biggest complaint, he had interrupted the start in order to Mandela's address, the famed to the nation. One caller asked if it meant that the station considered Hani as being above God. And I mean, just as the thing that the line that got me, that you wrote out, was that if there was black anger, there was also white hate. You reckon some of this still persists today?
Oh, I have no doubt it persists. It's incredible just how often all of us in the media, on social media in particular, now that people think that they are free to be prejudiced in all sorts of ways, that we see this. I think we made some incredible progress, in many ways, but I don't know, maybe as one grows older, I'm disappointed by humanity, and I'm particularly disappointed by our own humanity in South Africa, that after everything we've gone through, that those sentiments that you read out are still ones that I find almost every week when I write my column on Times Live and my column in the Financial Mail, and you read the comments below. If you say the water is not running in Durban, instead
Which
of
practically sometimes isn't.
yes, absolutely. Now this is a matter of a government that is failing to fulfill its promises. But the leap in those comment sections is straight to these derogatory word, can't do, It's absolutely distressing to see the hate, which was in public on the radio then, which you see all the time. Whether you go to a progressive website or a non-progressive website, that it's pretty much the same filth, really. So we've made huge progress in many ways, but I think in many parts of our society, I find I'm distressed by it that we haven't moved that far ahead of where we were. So it persists. I don't want to say that we haven't made some progress. We have, but it's still distressingly high. Where you find in public discourse the kind we seem to think being able to express a viewpoint gives you a license to be prejudiced. It doesn't, but people just prejudice, or it just comes out because people just haven't dealt with their own prejudices. So it just spews out, and it tells you more about the country than we can, than we sometimes think this country is. So I'd like to say no, we're not like that, but we are still very much like that. But it's a hate. Hate is, with these elections coming up in
Yeah.
May, I think you'll see those kinds of sentiments again coming up in a huge number. And maybe we've moved on, and maybe we are more relaxed at other times. But hate is still part of the fabric of the society, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, we've literally got 5 minutes left, and I still have a ton of questions to ask you. But I mean, you just touched on the issue of the columns that you write, and the comments that you get. You've alluded to the fact that we're going into an election period. The idea of fake news, false facts, things which start taking on the status of truth, and social media are certainly not helping. But I mean, you're finding this happening in the mainstream as well, even if your comments are now coming via digital rather than letters to the editor and so on. But it also reminds me of the way in which not just Mandela and others, but Hani in particular, was depicted in the press, right, at that time. And there's some startling facts that you will find out for those of you who don't know about a minister, a white minister at the time, Gerrit Viljoen, who Ahani disarmed through his knowledge of Greek, ancient Greek, not just Greek, and philosophy. But if you want to know more about that and some startling information about Gerrit himself, you should get the book. But just as I wanted to ask you, and if I can just reflect on this, in the months before he was murdered, Hani was demonized by the press. 6 days before his murder, the Afrikaans newspaper Rapport, the second largest Sunday paper, alleged that Hani and Mandela's former wife, Winnie, were about to start and were plotting to start a different political party called the Black People's Army. Many of the domestic and foreign, especially British press, and their coverage of Mandela and the ANC had from 1990 evolved from painting the party as a terrorist group. Thatcher once described the ANC as a typical terrorist organization, to then shift to describing them as a reasonable grouping ready to do business. But the demonization of Hani and a handful of other leaders, particularly Winnie, continued amongst many of the media outlets. Hani was painted as violent, racist, terrorist, and anti Mandela, who was hell bent on a race war, despite the fact that the two men frequently stood at the same platform. And Hani believed completely the contrary to everything that is being said here. How, given that you're a media practitioner, you were an editor, you are a media entrepreneur, you ran a television show, you worked across how is it that these things which are fabricated and fake take on the status of truth?
They were deliberate. A lot of misinformation, and the type we'll see in these elections, and that you're seeing in the U.S. and many other jurisdictions as we go. They are not just one person sitting there. They are deliberate, and they are spread by with money, with all kinds of things. So what happened with Chris Hani was basically that there were people within the state, within the government and the National Party government of the time, who did not believe in the project to negotiate, or even if they believed in it, they wanted to weaken the ANC and all progressive forces. In fact, all the forces that they were negotiating with and against. And so Chris Hani was a victim, if you will, of all that. That story about the Black People's Army was planted deliberately by members of military intelligence, if memory serves me well from my own book, by members of military intelligence. It was given to a journalist from the Sunday Times in England who was based here, who was a well-known conduit for these kinds of stories. It was given to report, and afterwards, many of those people confessed, and there are many people nowadays who go around saying, "Oh, Justice is Stratcom, Ebrahim is Stratcom," but actually, strategic communications of that time, this is what they did, and they did it. That entire Black People's Army story was concocted um, by National Party apartheid intelligence and planted with pliant journalists who took it hook, line, and sinker and wrote it up nationally and internationally. It was a total, complete fabrication and a lie.
And tragically, people who propounded that lie were doing it for a particular political purpose. And today, those of us who use social media, those of us who are on it, have to be much more discerning about what we believe as truth, and how we debunk narratives which are constructed. Because here was a narrative about Hani which took on a status which was completely, fundamentally contradictory to what it. Justice, thanks so much. We've literally gone 2 minutes over time. We could have continued. I have about 8 other questions. Perhaps I'll reserve that for that lunch that you owe me. But thank you so much for making the time. Thank you to the organizers of the Time of the Writer to get us here, and for us to talk, giving us an opportunity to talk about this book. I would say get it. It's fluent. It's articulate. There's some prize barbs written in that book only in the way that Malala can write them, and so it really is a worthwhile read. Thank you so much for writing the book, and thanks for joining us to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Ebrahim. Thanks for everyone for joining, and thanks to Time of the Writer. I really appreciate the questions and the engagement, Ebrahim. Thanks so much. We're going to dinner for sure when I next see you.
Thanks, Justice. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
Goodbye, everyone. Hope you had a lovely time. A difficult subject, but something that we have to talk about. And I hope you all get a copy of the book. Thanks very much.